In June 2020, Wirecard AG, once valued at 24 billion euros and a member of Germany's prestigious DAX 30 index, filed for insolvency. The company's CEO, Markus Braun, had been arrested days earlier. Its chief operating officer, Jan Marsalek, had disappeared and was the subject of an international manhunt. Nearly 2 billion euros were missing, supposedly held in trust accounts in the Philippines that didn't exist. Germany's financial regulator BaFin, which had spent years defending Wirecard and investigating journalists who questioned the company, faced humiliation. Ernst Young, one of the Big Four accounting firms that had audited Wirecard for over a decade, came under intense scrutiny for missing signs of what prosecutors would later call one of the largest fraud cases in European history. This is the story of how a German payments company fooled investors, regulators, and auditors for years, and how its spectacular collapse exposed deep flaws in European financial oversight. Wirecard's origins trace back to 1999, during the early days of e-commerce. Markus Braun, an Austrian entrepreneur with a background in consulting and technology, didn't found Wirecard, but would become synonymous with the company. The original business, started by others, focused on payment processing for online gambling and adult entertainment websites, industries that traditional banks were reluctant to serve. These were high-risk sectors with regulatory challenges, but they were also lucrative if you could manage the compliance complexities. In the early 2000s, Braun joined the company and quickly rose through the ranks, becoming CEO in 2002. Under his leadership, Wirecard pivoted from its seedy origins toward mainstream payment processing, positioning itself as a modern fintech competitor to established players like PayPal and traditional payment networks. Braun was an unlikely figure to lead a major German corporation. He was Austrian, not German, and came from a technology background rather than traditional finance or banking. He wore jeans and sneakers to work, a stark contrast to the formal attire typical of German business culture. He spoke in techno-utopian language about disrupting payments and building the future of digital commerce. This positioning, tech disruptor rather than stodgy financial services company, would prove central to Wirecard's identity and appeal. Braun understood that being classified as a technology company rather than a financial services firm meant higher valuations, more investor enthusiasm, and less regulatory scrutiny. He marketed Wirecard as Germany's answer to Silicon Valley, a rare homegrown tech success story in a country better known for automobiles and industrial manufacturing than software innovation. Throughout the 2000s and early 2010s, Wirecard grew aggressively, both organically and through acquisitions. The company went public and gradually expanded its services beyond payment processing to include issuing credit cards, providing point-of-sale terminals for merchants, and offering banking services. Braun was a master of corporate storytelling. In investor presentations and media interviews, he painted a picture of unstoppable growth driven by the shift from cash to digital payments, the explosion of e-commerce, and the rise of mobile transactions. Wirecard claimed partnerships with major brands and financial institutions. The company reported year after year of double-digit revenue growth and expanding profit margins, performance that seemed to validate Braun's vision and strategy. By the mid-2010s, Wirecard was a darling of German finance. Its stock price had risen dramatically, making early investors wealthy and creating paper billionaires among company insiders. Braun himself became one of Germany's richest men, his stake in Wirecard worth billions on paper. The company attracted blue-chip institutional investors and was added to Germany's DAX 30 index in 2018, replacing Commerzbank. This was a symbolic moment, a fintech company displacing a traditional bank in Germany's most prestigious stock index. Politicians celebrated Wirecard as proof that Germany could compete in the digital economy. Chancellor Angela Merkel personally lobbied on behalf of the company during trade missions to China, where Wirecard was seeking to expand. The finance minister praised Wirecard's success. It seemed Wirecard had earned its place among Germany's corporate elite. But beneath the surface, troubling questions were emerging. In 2015, an investigative journalist writing for the Financial Times began publishing articles raising concerns about Wirecard's accounting practices and business operations. The journalist, Dan McCrum, noted discrepancies in the company's financial statements, questioned the profitability of certain business units, and suggested that revenue might be inflated or even fabricated. His reporting focused on Wirecard's third-party partner network in Asia, businesses that supposedly processed payments on Wirecard's behalf. McCrum's sources alleged that some of these partners didn't actually exist or were generating fake transactions. The articles were detailed and damning, but they faced an extraordinary response. Germany's financial regulator BaFin didn't investigate Wirecard. It investigated the Financial Times and short sellers betting against the company. BaFin filed a criminal complaint against the Financial Times journalists, accusing them of market manipulation. The regulator imposed a temporary ban on short-selling Wirecard stock, an extremely rare measure typically reserved for financial crises. Publicly, BaFin officials defended Wirecard and criticized what they called a coordinated attack by short sellers and journalists. Wirecard's leadership portrayed the Financial Times reporting as a malicious smear campaign orchestrated by hedge funds seeking to profit from the stock's decline. Braun accused McCrum of being in league with short sellers. German politicians echoed these defenses, framing the attacks on Wirecard as threats to German business interests and national pride. The narrative became, Wirecard was a German success story being targeted by foreign speculators and the Anglo-American financial press. This response had a chilling effect on scrutiny of Wirecard. If the regulator and politicians were defending the company, and if questioning Wirecard's numbers could lead to criminal investigation, who would continue asking uncomfortable questions? For several years, this protective wall held. Wirecard's stock price recovered from each bout of negative press. Investors who had doubted the company looked foolish as the stock continued to rise. Braun appeared vindicated. The company kept reporting strong results, and its auditor, Ernst Young, gave clean bills of health year after year. Wirecard seemed untouchable. But McCrum and other skeptics persisted. In 2019, the Financial Times published new investigations, this time with internal Wirecard documents that appeared to show systematic fraud in the company's Asian operations. The documents suggested that Wirecard employees had created fake contracts, forged signatures, and fabricated invoices to inflate revenue. Whistleblowers came forward with allegations of a culture of fraud extending to Wirecard's headquarters in Munich. One whistleblower described a system where certain business units existed primarily on paper, their reported profits completely divorced from reality. The scale of the alleged fraud was staggering, potentially billions of euros in fake revenue over multiple years. This time, the pressure forced action. Germany's financial regulator finally commissioned a special audit of Wirecard to be conducted by KPMG. The investigation took months. In April 2020, KPMG released its findings. The report was devastating. KPMG said it could not verify the existence of substantial portions of Wirecard's reported revenue and profits. The auditors found evidence of falsified documents, sham contracts, and transactions that appeared to lack economic substance. Critically, KPMG expressed skepticism about the existence of cash balances that Wirecard claimed to hold in trust accounts in Asia. These accounts, supposedly containing well over €1 billion, were essential to Wirecard's financial position. If the cash didn't exist, Wirecard was insolvent. The KPMG report triggered panic. Wirecard's stock price began to plummet. Creditors demanded answers. Regulators and prosecutors, embarrassed by years of defending the company, scrambled to investigate. Wirecard announced it would delay publishing its 2019 annual report while it investigated the trust account issue. The company claimed that the money existed but was temporarily unavailable due to complications with custodian banks in the Philippines. Braun insisted that missing cash would be found and that everything would be explained. But as days passed, the story kept changing. First, the money was in one bank in the Philippines. Then it was in several banks. Then Wirecard said it had received documents from the banks confirming the balances. But when Ernst Young, Wirecard's auditor, asked to verify the money directly with the banks said they had never held any Wirecard accounts. On June 18, 2020, Wirecard admitted that 1.9 billion euros in cash probably didn't exist. The company acknowledged that bank statements and other documents it had used to report the cash balances were likely forged. The announcement was stunning. A DAX 30 company, audited annually by a Big Four firm, had just admitted that nearly 2 billion euros on its balance sheet was fictitious. The stock collapsed, losing nearly all its value in hours. Wirecard's creditors moved to seize assets. The company's board fired Markus Braun, who had resigned as CEO just days earlier. Prosecutors arrested Braun on suspicion of accounting fraud and market manipulation. He was released on bail but remained under investigation. As investigators dug deeper, more shocking revelations emerged. Jan Marsalek, Wirecard's chief operating officer and Braun's right-hand man, had disappeared. Austrian by birth like Braun, Marsalek was responsible for Wirecard's operations in Asia, the source of much of the company's reported growth and the location of the missing cash. When prosecutors sought to question him, Marsalek fled Germany. His travel involved a level of sophistication that raised eyebrows. He reportedly used private jets and had contacts in Eastern Europe and Russia. As authorities traced his movements, they discovered he had flown to Belarus and then seemingly vanished. Reports later surfaced suggesting Marsalek had connections to Russian intelligence services, though these claims were difficult to verify. Interpol issued a red notice for his arrest, but as of years later, he remained at large. His disappearance added an element of international intrigue to what was already the biggest corporate fraud case in German history. The human cost of Wirecard's collapse extended beyond executives. Thousands of employees lost their jobs as the company disintegrated. Investors, many of them retail shareholders who had believed in the German Fintech dream, saw their savings evaporate. Pension funds and institutional investors wrote off billions in losses. Wirecard's creditors, owed nearly 4 billion euros, fought over the scraps of the bankrupt estate. The company's payment processing business, which actually worked and served real customers, was sold off in pieces. What had been billed as a cornerstone of Germany's digital economy became a symbol of catastrophic failure. The fallout extended to Germany's regulatory and auditing infrastructure. BaFin, which had spent years defending Wirecard and investigating its critics, faced intense criticism and calls for reform. The regulator's president eventually stepped due, and questions emerged about whether BaFin officials had been too close to Wirecard's management or too concerned with protecting a flagship German company to properly scrutinize its books. Germany's parliament launched investigations into regulatory failures. The government announced plans to strengthen BaFin's powers and increase oversight of financial statement auditing. Ernst Young faced existential questions about its role. How had one of the world's premier accounting firms audited Wirecard for over a decade without detecting a multi-billion-euro fraud? The firm defended itself by arguing that it had been deceived by sophisticated forgeries and that Wirecard management had actively obstructed verification efforts. But critics pointed out that auditors are supposed to be skeptical, especially when a company's reported performance seems too good to be true. The Financial Times had raised red flags for years based on publicly available information and basic detective work. Why hadn't Ernst Young, with full access to Wirecard's books, seen the same problems? The scandal raised broader questions about the auditing profession and whether conflicts of interest, auditors are paid by the companies they audit, compromise their independence. Prosecutors built criminal cases against Wirecard's leadership. Markus Braun maintained his innocence, claiming he was himself deceived by Marsalek and others. But investigators alleged that Braun was deeply involved in the fraud, pointing to his control over key decisions and his financial benefit from the inflated stock price. Multiple other executives and employees were arrested or faced charges. The legal proceedings would take years to resolve, but the scale of the alleged criminality was clear. This wasn't rogue employees in one division. Prosecutors argued it was systematic fraud directed from the top. The Wirecard scandal carries lessons that extend beyond Germany. It demonstrates the danger of mixing national pride with financial oversight. German officials were so invested in Wirecard's success as a homegrown tech champion that they were slow to acknowledge problems. This isn't unique to Germany. Regulators everywhere face pressure to support domestic champions. But effective regulation requires skepticism, not cheerleading. When regulators become defenders of the companies they're supposed to oversee, disaster becomes more likely. The case also highlights the limitations of traditional auditing. Ernst Young followed standard procedures, but those procedures proved insufficient to detect fraud when management was determined to hide it, and when the fraud involved international operations and complex corporate structures. The question isn't just whether Ernst Young failed, but whether the entire auditing model is adequate for modern global companies. If auditors can't verify the existence of cash supposedly held in foreign accounts, what can they verify? The scandal has prompted calls for more rigorous auditing standards, greater auditor liability, and potentially even public sector auditing of systemically important companies. For investors, Wirecard is a reminder that impressive growth, charismatic leadership, and regulatory approval don't guarantee a company is legitimate. Wirecard had every external marker of success: blue-chip investors, major customers, prestigious partnerships, a spot in the DAX 30. But the fundamentals were rotten. The journalists who questioned Wirecard's numbers were vindicated, though their voices were drowned out for years by management denials and regulatory pushback. The lesson is age-old, but perpetually relevant. If something seems too good to be true, it probably is. Companies that consistently report smooth growth and ever-expanding margins while operating in competitive industries should face extra scrutiny, not less. The story also illustrates the dangers of corporate complexity used as camouflage. Wirecard's structure involved subsidiaries in multiple countries, third-party partnerships, and merchant processing arrangements that were legitimately complicated. This complexity made fraud easier to hide and harder to detect. When a company's business model is difficult for outsiders to understand, that's sometimes because even the company's own executives don't fully understand how money is actually made. Skepticism about overly complex structures is warranted. Wirecard's collapse remains a defining moment in European business history. It shattered the myth that German efficiency and regulatory rigor made such scandals impossible in continental Europe. It showed that hubris, greed, and fraud are not uniquely American or Asian problems. They're human problems that can occur anywhere when the right conditions align. The scandal damaged Germany's reputation as a financial center and a safe place for investors. Years later, the fallout continues. Jan Marsalek remains at large. Criminal trials proceed slowly through German courts. Victims seek recovery through bankruptcy proceedings. And regulators and auditors face ongoing scrutiny about how they missed or ignored warning signs for so long. From a small payment processor serving online gambling sites to a DAX 30 company worth tens of billions, to a bankrupt fraud case with an internationally wanted fugitive and nearly 2 billion euros missing, Wirecard's trajectory is a cautionary tale. It demonstrates that no company is too prestigious, no auditor too reputable, and no regulator too sophisticated to be fooled by determined fraudsters. It shows the power of narrative. Braun's story about German fintech disrupting global payments was so appealing that people wanted to believe it, even when evidence suggested problems. And it serves as a reminder that in finance and business, skepticism is not cynicism, it's prudence. The journalists who questioned Wirecard were attacked and investigated, but they were right. Sometimes the critics are wrong, but sometimes, as Wirecard proved, they're right, and the entire establishment is wrong. That's a lesson worth remembering the next time a company seems too good to be true and the experts insist everything is fine.